Okay, it's just showing my team, so I think you need to try and get out to split view.
Okay, it's still just showing Mateen.
Yeah. Okay, it's just showing my team, so I think you need
Oh
to try
no,
and
it
get out to
shows it
split view.
by it's
Okay, it's still just showing Mateen.
it's just a lag. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you see that, James? It's lagged.
Yeah, I've muted it now. But are you able to get it so there's 4 of us?
I'm yes, I can. There is
So
that
going on speaker.
does that do it?
I have to wait
Yeah,
10 seconds
yes.
for me. Yeah,
We're all there.
Okay, and we'll go ahead and start.
Let me post on Instagram that we're live.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea because you got a ton of followers. Okay. So we're live on YouTube. I can't do it on both, obviously. It won't let me. So we'll just put the link on the Facebook page. I'll do that right now. Team, do you have the link if you want to put it on your Instagram?
I just put it on our Instagram, so it should. Let me check to make sure it worked.
Because I have the
Give
YouTube
people a
link.
few minutes to trickle in.
Yeah, here's the YouTube link if you want to put it up there. I don't know if did you get it or not.
Yeah, it's live on our Airline Geeks Instagram. I can post on my other account as well. Okay, 9 viewers, pretty good.
People who are on now will get started here in just a few minutes. We're just trying to do some last second stuff here. All right, you all ready to get started?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get going.
Definitely.
All right. Okay. There we go. Got that. All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to our sort of editor's discussion here about COVID-19 and its impacts on the U.S., or frankly, the global airline industry too. There's really nothing off the table here. We figured just Friday afternoon, we wanted to open this up and, have a discussion here about the impacts and the ongoing outlook. And hopefully, try to make sure that it's not all bad news. We have a lot of stuff to talk about. And as always, if you want to, in the chat room there, we have somebody monitoring the chat. So if you want to send in questions, feel free to do so. And you can put them right there in the chat room, and we'll be sure to talk about them here on this discussion. We also have a few questions that were sent in throughout the week by some folks, and a few discussions that we wanted to bring up as well. So I'm going to go through here. We have James, who's our European team lead, who runs the whole operation over there. He's also a copy editor for us and does a lot of copy editing work. We have Mateen, who runs our content strategy and also does editing work for us. And of course, Parker's with us too and is our editor-in-chief. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody, and I'll go ahead and start with you, Parker, to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, my name's Parker Davis. I've been a member of Airline Geeks since August 2016. I started off as a writer and then worked my way up to senior writer, and just earlier this year began working as editor-in-chief. Currently, I'm a student at Duke University in North Carolina, and while I'm not studying anything related to aviation, I'd love to go into the industry after I finish school. So I'll hand it off to either James or Mateen.
James, why don't you touch on yourself?
Yeah. Okay. So evening, everyone. I'm James. I've been with Airline Geeks since 2015 as a writer. I'm currently out over in Europe. Well, that's where I'm from. I'm from the UK, but I live in Berlin. And I've been with I've been with Airline Geeks since 2015, and just recently started helping out on the editing side. And also having an overview of our European content. And in my day job, I'm also an airline pilot for one of Europe's airlines, which gives me a good, unique insight into the operations of an airline, as well as of operating an aircraft itself. And that's it from me. I'll hand it over to Mateen.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Mateen Kontoravdis. I have been with Airline Geeks since early 2017. I've been doing some writing, editing, and most recently creating a new strategy for us to deliver to you all the best aviation news in the best ways we can. I'm a sophomore at the University of Texas here in Austin. I'm also, like Parker, not studying aviation specifically. However, I am hoping to get in the industry upon graduating. So really excited for today's conversation. Ryan, do we want to get started with the first questions?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and introduce myself too. So I'm not the last man standing here, but so I'm Ryan. I'm sort of the founder of Airline Geeks. I started it 2013. Yeah, so it's been 7 years. And in my real life too, I'm a student. I'm studying aviation management as a bachelor's degree, hoping to pursue my master's in human factors in aviation at some point. And my sort of specialty on the side is I sort of know a lot about FARs, Federal Aviation Regulations, and compliance and all that kind of stuff. So that's always been what I've done on the side too. I think Mateen, did you want to bring up kind of our first question there? I know you took some notes on it to touch point.
So we've got a great first question coming in from one of our viewers. For everyone here, given how limited the US and Africa market has been historically, what are the potential implications to this market and potential for expansion post-coronavirus?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it's a very specific question, sort of in that realm. As it sort of stands right now, there's not a ton of connectivity between the U.S. And Africa. I mean, in retrospect, not compared to other continents, Asia, Europe, South America, but I'm not really sure. And again, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't know the numbers. I didn't research the numbers down in Africa, but I'm not sure of their case count, but I know there's been some repatriation flights from Africa. There's been a lot of those to the U.S. I know South African Airways has done some. So there's certainly a market for it, for that kind of stuff. I just don't know when that'll recover. I'm kind of interested, James, what you would think being on sort of that side of the world per se.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest airlines that's been sort of looked at is South African Airways, also because of they've been in a bit of trouble over the past couple of years anyway, and then this has probably wiped out any of the revenues that they were having in the first place. And recently, we've been seeing that a lot of their employees, they haven't been paid since May, and so there is obviously a cash flow problem there. And I think they had the administrators in at the start of the year anyway to try and sort out the airline. But what I think, looking across Europe, is that even the most fragile airlines in the industry, if you look at Alitalia and also Norwegian, you would expect such an event to the industry to kind of wipe out the weakest competition, the weakest airlines. Yet Alitalia has been renationalized or is in process of being renationalized by the Italian government. Norwegian, they've had some investors step in from China. So it looks like, albeit at a smaller size, these two airlines in particular will continue into the future. And maybe that's what we would expect from South African Airways as well, in particular as the national carrier for South Africa, which obviously has a lot of global links. So I think they're one airline to watch for in terms of African connectivity. Obviously, a lot of tourists go to South Africa, across the rest of the continent there. But I think South African is one of the main airlines to watch to see how they fare towards the end of the year and then into next year.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Who knows if this is the nail in the coffin for South African? I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion about it. But I know their government wasn't too keen on bailing them out either again. So even with this whole crisis, we'll have to see what happens there.
But what happened with Alitalia is that they're basically they're starting from scratch, kind of. I don't know. I don't think there'll be a rebranding as such, but it might be a case where they let the airline fall, and then from the ashes they rebuild it up and start from a clean slate, which could be the same for South Africa.
Yeah, but if you look at the market as a whole, I mean, I think the question touched on it. I mean, it's been a market without a whole lot of traffic in the last couple of years, and I think as we start to move out of the kind of the virus period, as we start to see a recovery in the airline industry, both domestic in the U.S. and global, I think something important to keep in mind is that as the recovery doesn't go at full speed, airlines are going to be very hesitant to start new routes. So while I think James could be right, you might see companies that might have been struggling, still continue to exist and continue to operate routes they have been. I think you're unlikely to see a lot of new traffic going forward. So I think a lot of the additions, like American Airlines flight to Morocco, that might still happen, but I don't think you're going to see much more along those lines.
Definitely. And one other airline in Africa that I think is really important to take a close look at is Ethiopian Airlines, because prior to the pandemic, they were expanding really fast. They had just inaugurated a new flight between Houston and which connected to West Africa. And they've got a really diverse fleet as well, right? So they have aircraft that can do all sorts of missions. And they've become a really dominant player in the market in kind of a short span of time. These past 10 years, especially, they've been growing a lot faster than some of the competitors in the region. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how they are able to adapt and potentially become a mainstream competitor to the airlines in the Middle East, such as Emirates, Qatar, and Etihad, because these are three airlines that are dealing with major losses right now, and they really do depend on the connecting passengers. So one thing Ethiopian has is it has a lot of origin passengers as well. So if they can really optimize the schedule to provide connections between North America and Asia, and also Africa, they can become a big player, in my opinion, in the market.
Right. And those sort of, I mean, if we want to talk about that, those Middle East three carriers weren't exactly positioned for a crisis like this either. I mean, in terms of their fleet reliability too. I mean, Emirates has so many A380s that, they're going to feel that pain for sure. They already have.
And even so, the fleets that they've grounded at their 380s ever since, and I think it's just they're operating their 777s out on their skeleton routes across their network across the globe. So, and they also have, I think, another 20 still to come on order. So
yeah, they still have about 8 aircraft, I believe, 8 more 380s. They're waiting to take delivery of. One thing we should talk about Emirates, though, is they've been getting a lot of bad press recently about having so many A380s and the aircraft are going to be redundant. But if we're being completely honest, we're not really sure yet how the flying public is going to want to fly going into the future. So the increased space that the A380 offers could potentially give Emirates or other airlines with A380 aircraft an advantage if they're now putting aircraft with the premium economy cabin configuration, because people may really value space and the ability to know that they're not really packed like they used to be in the economy cabins. So I think it's too early to draw conclusions yet about whether the A380 is really going to be gone or not.
just to tie in onto the subject of the Middle East, one of the people in the chat, Amir, I think it is asking in terms of how the Middle Eastern carriers are faring in all of this. Emirates, for example. Well, obviously this week we talked, we released a story about their job losses that they're imposing on their crew, around 600 pilots and also a few thousand cabin crew. And I think that's been done in stages. And what from the stories that I've heard through my pilot community is that the way that these job cuts have been handled have just been sort of brutal, with people getting letters or emails to report to their head office the next day. And when they arrive, there's security at the door and they walk into a room with one of their managers, and 5 minutes later they're walking out and handing over their identifications for the airline. And there's people in that company that have been there for 15, 20 years working as training captains, and it's taken them a 5-minute conversation to be told that they were part of the process to be made redundant. And from what the rumors are flying around is that there is no real basis on how this has been handled, rather that they've looked at people's sickness rates and they've looked at all sorts of pilot grading materials, such as how much extra fuel pilots have taken or their training reports. And it's just completely brutal. And maybe that's because of the lack of labor laws that they have in the Middle East. We can expect this potentially across Qatar and Etihad. Etihad, I think, has been sort of the weakest major carrier in the Middle East. They've cancelled a lot of aircraft. They've shrunken their fleet a little bit. Qatar has continued to fly throughout this, albeit again on a skeleton network. They've done a lot of cargo. They've done a lot of passenger flights, even though they've been carrying 10 or 12 people from, Chicago back to Doha. A friend of mine, he operated that flight, and yeah, he had one person in business and 11 people in economy on a 12, 13-hour flight. So they've still been doing it, but also they've been cutting their contracts and also making their redundancies. So I think the Middle East is a pretty brutal place to be in terms of how the airlines will handle this, but they also have the ability to cut money, their expenditure quick in terms of reducing their flight crew bill and their wage bill for their employees. So yeah, just looking at the chat here, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else about the Middle East, just so we can kind of stick to the same part of the world as we move through it.
It's actually been very interesting to see Qatar Airways and how they've really been marketing the whole pandemic. Most airlines have been um, saying, we're here for you when you're ready to fly again and all that. But Qatar Airways has actually kept the majority of its routes flying throughout the pandemic and saying, we're here for you now if you want to travel. So I think they're trying to take a very interesting approach to this and try to be like the airline that was there for you during the pandemic so that you kind of remember that post pandemic as well, which is definitely an interesting way to look at it.
No, I think that's absolutely an interesting way to look at it. But I think it's easier to do that when you kind of have a guaranteed safety net to fall back on. I mean, I think U.S. airlines have done that domestically with government bailouts, so they can continue operating domestic routes. Qatar has kind of done the same thing on an international scale, but I think they've taken that position, but at the same time, their costs, their daily costs are going to be much higher than just about anyone else who's still operating a route network that might be a fraction of what it was before.
Oh, yeah, the costs are definitely going to be a lot higher. But one place I would venture to say Emirates and Qatar Airways especially have an advantage over the US airlines is they have a lot of experience doing cargo flying. They operate their own unique cargo fleets. So when the whole thing came out that we need to now send medical supplies all over the world, I think Emirates and Qatar Airways, initially at least, were in a better spot to be able to capitalize on that and provide the services requested. Now, of course, the U.S. airlines as well, they are very large, interesting organizations that can adapt to different situations instantly. So they are probably now able to make some money there as well. But I think, especially compared to airlines in Europe as well, these two airlines had a big advantage with their cargo fleets initially, at least.
No, absolutely. And I mean, talking about the U.S., I think it'd be a good time to transition that way. We've gotten a lot of questions about, is it possible that we could see, a U.S. airline or even a major European airline go bankrupt in the weeks or months ahead? It was something that I know the Sun Country CEO, or Sun Country, or Boeing CEO, sorry, said that he expected we'd see a carrier go bankrupt in kind of the fallout of the coronavirus's effect on the aviation industry. So I'll open that up to you guys. What do you all think of that question, and any predictions?
I mean, I watched that interview too on the Today Show that Boeing CEO
Calhoun.
Calhoun had said on that forum, or Savannah Guthrie had asked him, and I thought it was a pretty shocking statement, especially coming from an aircraft manufacturer CEO, because that's kind of the shot heard around the world, and to their thousands of partners that they deliver to, not just the ones in the U.S., but the ones around the world. But I mean, if you want to bring it in a little bit too, I mean, the ones in the U.S., I mean, they've been partners since day one. United, Southwest, I mean, Alaska, these all, virtually largely Boeing operators, all of a sudden they have their, biggest suppliers saying, oh, well, we're expecting a major airline to go out of business. And that's, I think that's the shot heard around the world. Personally, I don't think it'll happen. I think, the recovery will be painful. It'll be slow, and we'll see a lot of smaller airlines that go under. And we've seen that with Compass and, a bunch of others. And I worry too about, smaller regional operators, especially the individual ones like SkyWest or Mesa that don't have the sort of backing of the major carriers beyond the, the contracts. They're not wholly owned. So I worry about that too. But, at the end of the day, I just don't think that was an appropriate comment for him to make. And I don't think a major airline will go under. I think the government will help them out to a very long extent.
Yeah, I don't see it either. Potentially one of the smaller ultra low cost carriers I was thinking at first, but really if you look at the numbers, they are doing not really well right now, but they're doing better than we initially thought they were positioned to do, because they are now, for example, Frontier Airlines, we did an article about this a few weeks back. They just announced a summer update to their schedule, and they're really repositioning their aircraft to fly the leisure routes that Americans are flying right now. So they are really capitalizing on that. And that's something interesting about the smaller airlines, the ultra low cost carriers as well. They don't really operate on the whole hub and spoke model. So they don't need to be in Dallas to be successful, right? They can be wherever they need to be. So I really don't see it. I think instead we're going to have a very um, interesting time watching the airlines readapt their schedule to how the people want to fly. I think something else that's important to talk about is what is the future of the hub and spoke model? Because quite frankly, now that everyone is more interested in the hygiene aspect of travel, I don't think it'll be very appealing to say, hey, I need to go from, let's say, Austin to Chicago, and I don't think people will want to have a layover at a major hub airport if they can avoid it. So it'll be very interesting to see if airlines can adapt their schedules to accommodate.
And I think John in our live chat asked about that too. And I think what'll do really well is airlines like Allegiant, who do not operate with the traditional hub and spoke model, Southwest to some extent too, and Spirit. These low-cost airlines who just do pretty much purely point A to point B. I mean, there is some small hub and spoke for Allegiant. I mean, you could say Vegas is sort of kind of like that, but you don't see a ton of connections going out there, if any at all. And so, I think those will really play in. And I mean, I think it's, telling how well Allegiant is performing right now compared to the other U.S. airlines.
Yeah, go ahead, James.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just to try to keep track of the questions that we are being asked, is one of the questions that was asked just because we're on this topic was, what do we think about the regional airlines in the US? And do we think, he's put WO airline. I don't know if that's an airline in the US that I'm unaware of. Do you think WO airlines such as Envoy and Endeavor will be better off than others such as Republic?
Well, we just sort of touched on that, and I mentioned, Mason SkyWest is another really good example of that too. But you could take that two ways. Like Republic's an individual operator, and they might not do as well because they don't have the backing of a major airline. But you could reverse that, and you could also say that an airline like PSA or Envoy, who's directly wholly owned by a airline, they might perform poorly too, because they might be dragged down by the major carrier. So there's ways you could look at that.
I mean, I think if you look at least at the ones that aren't owned by major carriers, a lot of the contracts that regional carriers have with mainline domestic U.S. carriers are like, the way they work is airlines pay them almost a flat fee to operate a specific flight, and then all the revenue from that flight goes to the airlines. So if there are 6 passengers on it, then the major airline will lose money while the regional airline will do fine. But airlines will turn a profit if you start to see more full flights. So I mean, I think the biggest question is just going to be, are airlines going to be willing to pay that flat fee versus trying to operate their own aircraft? Because if American or United deems it easier to operate an A319 on a flight than pay Mesa to operate an ERJ, then I think you'll see those airlines start to crumble. And that's not, I don't think that's something we can really answer right now, but I think that's just something we're gonna have to wait and see going forward.
Just some other questions that were being asked in terms of the US. Does anyone know any insight into the current load factors of some of the US airlines and their routes? And then also, which of the 4 major US airlines is best positioned to recover? This is from Lily.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of questions there, but I think the load factors, I mean, airlines don't always really, casually release their load factors for obvious reasons, but you know, Allegiant's been one that's performed very well. I think their load factor was it's above 50%, and it has been recently. And today, you know, American's load factor was reported to be pretty good. You know, for the month of June so far in their SEC filing, they reported a pretty decent number. So, you know, you could say that of the major U.S. airlines is well positioned. I mean, I'd have to, you know, it's hard. That's a hard one to answer. I think it would probably be a toss up between Southwest and maybe American. But they're all pretty well positioned anyways, because they're all such formidable forces in the market that, you know, they're so essential that I don't think the government will let them fail. It's the old, you know, too big to fail thing. So, you know, I think Southwest, because of its model and the business model and heavily domestic operation, you know, I think they'll do very well in the marketplace going forward. And, you know, as people start picking up and, you know, given their route network too, they'll do very well. But, you know, the reason I kind of said American, I know a lot of people give me a hard time about that. I think American sort of has reported a little bit, you know, better off numbers, not financially, but, you know, in terms of load factors, and their domestic operations has been very strong too. They've always had a very large domestic market share. So, you know, going forward, I think they'll be better positioned in the domestic market. You know, it's, as I always say, you're very hard pressed to find a place that American Airlines doesn't fly, especially in the U.S. So, you know, that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, if you
I'm actually.
go ahead,
Go ahead, Parker. Sorry.
Okay, well, if you look at just finances on their own, I mean, Southwest is miles ahead of, you know, the other three
Absolutely.
large U.S. airlines, and then Delta comes in a, you know, pretty second almost alone, and then United and American fall pretty far behind, at least based on their numbers in the first quarter and in a lot of last year too. I think really, you know, the second quarter is going to wrap up at the end of this month, and I think in the beginning of August we should start to hear more from airlines as to their second quarter numbers, and I think those are really going to tell the full story. I mean, if it continues to look as it did in the first quarter, I think Southwest lost, I think, like $95 million, and Delta, I think 700 or so million, and then United and American are both around 2 billion. So if it looks like that again, with the same sort of staggering, I think I would confidently put my money on Southwest and then Delta. But if not, then I think, you know, it's a toss up in that regard. But I think Ryan's right to say that nobody's going to fail out of those four. They're, I think, far too important to the, you know, to the economy in terms of the jobs they provide and in terms of the connectivity they provide. I mean, I think that's just the reality of having four carriers that have almost total dominance in a country like the U.S.
Yeah, and actually, I think, yeah, I wanted to make the case for Delta Airlines because even pre-coronavirus, they were, at least from a passenger perspective, they were on another level compared to their two big competitors here in the U.S. With the development that they had been doing on board their aircraft, the technology they were using, the product offering was on par with, I would say, some of the really good European airlines. Actually, I had a chance to fly the Delta One suites last December, and it was on par with a flight I had with Singapore Airlines. Actually, the crew was probably even better. So from a people perspective, I think Delta has an upper hand there because they have some phenomenal leadership as well. Their CEO has been really proactive, as has everyone else. But one other big thing that Delta has that the other U.S. airlines don't right now, I think, is the Airbus 220, which is a really good plane for social distancing because of the whole layout of the aircraft. So, because it's a small jet, and for those who don't know, the interior is a 3-2 configuration, kind of like the McDonnell Douglas jets they just retired, except way more efficient. So this aircraft is going to cater to the routes where there's not a lot of demand. There is demand, and they can also social distance. So I think, as everyone else has said, the airlines at this point are too big to fail um, from what I can tell. But I think post coronavirus, I think Delta is going to be very well positioned to keep growing and keep doing what they were doing beforehand.
Just to bring in a question I was asked on YouTube by Victor, just what do you guys think about Delta removing the middle seat section? I personally haven't been following this. I don't know if you guys have over in the US what they're planning on doing in terms of their hygiene.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, if I could be candid, I don't think it does anything. Frankly, I mean, I think if it's a peace of mind thing. I mean, when you block middle seats or you limit load. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really do anything. I don't think from an epidemiology standpoint. I think it's more of a mental thing. It makes people feel better, as I said. So, I think Delta's doing it because it's more of a PR stunt than anything. But it's not they're, I guess making people feel better about getting on their planes is important. So I think that's why they're doing it.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. I mean, if you listen to the guidance from the CDC here in the U.S. and other health authorities, I mean, having having the 2.5 feet of space between you and the passenger next to you that the middle seat being empty offers, I mean, that doesn't really sound like it does a whole lot for for somebody's health. But I mean, if passengers look at that and say, well, I mean, Delta's going the extra mile, they must really care about my health, then I think that does a lot more to get them business than anything else really does. So if that's what customers are looking for right now, looking for an airline to really just an airline that cares about them in a way, then I think that's what the middle seat selection debacle of the last couple months has really led to us.
Yeah, one more note on that too. I mean, it's fascinating. The airline consumer here in the U.S. particularly. I mean, I think at least for the travelers people that are flying now, low fares now more than ever are going to rule the world. And I don't think. I mean, as you can see with Allegiant and these other low-cost airlines, people don't really care about the onboard experience right now. They just want to go visit their family or do whatever they're doing, traveling right now. And I think social sort of, PR stuff like that, it'll work to some extent to the more frequent flyers, but, it might not work otherwise. So, so do we want to take one more question from the audience?
Well, there are some sort of big ones that could be fit into. Again, they're sort of big questions that need a bit of time to answer. I'd say there's nothing that are quick fire responses.
Let me have a look here, see if we can. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Anybody see any questions that they want to bring up? I know we have a couple still left in there.
I will just quickly answer one about someone asked, are major European airlines likely in the need of a bailout, i.e. airlines like British Airways and Lufthansa? Well, from Europe, what we've seen is a lot of the airlines have taken money from the governments on their state aid. Lufthansa, I believe they've accepted a 9 billion euro bailout by the German government in relation, and in return gives a 20% stake of their airline to the government. But the last thing that I heard, it may have changed again, but the board of the Lufthansa group rejected it. But Air France, KLM, all the national carriers across continental Europe have kind of taken money. Obviously, we talked about Alitalia and how they've been restructured and renationalized anyway. British Airways themselves, as part of IAG, they haven't taken a bailout as such. They've accessed government money that was for any company to access if they had the right credit rating. So they use some of the government money to pay their staff whilst the airline was not operating. And they also, BA as part of IAG also have Vueling, Aer Lingus, Iberia across down in Spain and Ireland. And what BA have got a lot of been criticised for is the fact that the Air Europa Spanish carrier was IAG had started the buying process of Air Europa, and the CEO of IAG had taken a lot of criticism because they announced that British Airways were cutting 12,000 jobs, but also at the same time that they were proceeding to continue with the acquisition of Air Europa for over £1 billion. So that's still a story there to be continued. So from a bailout perspective, yeah, I would say if you wanted to find more information about that, I'm sure on our website we have a lot of coverage regarding which airlines have received which money from the state. And this will continue because it's not over yet. Even though airlines are starting to build up their flying programs, the financial side is still yet to be sorted out.
Right. No, that's interesting. That gets a whole other perspective from the other side. But this is where we're going to wrap it up today, at least for this session. Where we plan to do these regularly, and we're hoping to do one again next Friday this time. So 2 p.m. Pacific time US, so that'd be 5 p.m. Eastern time. And this is something that we're going to try to do regularly, have discussions. We might, we're certainly going to bring on more members of our team to talk about more specific things, articles that they specialize in from all different regions of the globe. And, subject matter experts on various topics whenever they're available. So yeah, that wraps it up here for us. And we appreciate y'all joining. Be sure to turn into our social media channels for the latest information and, our next planned get together here. And also be sure to tune into our website too. We'll be making announcements there. Thank you, all. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good one.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.